The night of October 31st, 1967, was like any other in the Mekong Delta. It was a thick, wet darkness, a blackness so complete it felt like a physical weight on the eyes. The air, heavy with the scent of mud and rotting vegetation, carried the chirp of insects and the distant croak of frogs. For the Vietcong, moving silently in their sampan down the murky waters of the Bassac River, this was not a hostile environment. It was home. It was their fortress. The thousands of miles of rivers and canals that webbed the delta were their highways, their supply lines, their escape routes. They were the masters of this liquid labyrinth, ghosts who moved with the current, confident in the belief that the American behemoth, with its heavy armor and loud helicopters, was deaf and blind here. The Americans owned the day, but the night and the water belonged to the revolution. Aboard the small wooden boat, 3 men in black pajamas guided their cargo of ammunition and medical supplies toward a hidden depot. They were careful, but not fearful. Their senses were tuned to the familiar rhythms of the river. A splash could be a fish. A rustle in the nipa palm could be a water snake. They had no reason to suspect that the greatest danger on this river was not from the jungle, but from the water itself. They did not know that less than 50 yards away, submerged in the foul, leech-infested water with only their eyes and the muzzles of their rifles breaking the surface, were 7 American ghosts. These were not soldiers. They were something else entirely. What the Vietcong cadre didn't know, what their entire command structure had not yet learned, was that their greatest strategic advantage, their sanctuary, was about to become their tomb. They were witnessing, in their final moments, the arrival of the weapon that would systematically and psychologically dismantle their control of the Delta. They were about to learn that the night and the water no longer belonged to them. The illusion was about to be shattered by sudden, overwhelming violence. To understand the terror that was about to be unleashed, one had to first understand the absolute certainty it replaced. For years, the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies had perfected the art of guerrilla war in the South. Their doctrine was one of patience, of attrition, of turning the enemy's strength into a weakness. In the Mekong Delta, this doctrine found its most perfect expression. The region was South Vietnam's Rice Bowl, a vast, flat expanse of paddies, swamps, and jungle, all crosshatched by an estimated 3,000 miles of navigable waterways. For the American military, it was a tactical nightmare. Tanks bogged down in the mud. Large infantry formations were easily spotted and ambushed. The dense foliage and intricate network of canals made conventional search and destroy missions an exercise in futility. But for the Viet Cong, it was a paradise. The water was their lifeblood. Sampans and junks, indistinguishable from civilian traffic, moved men and material with near impunity. Secret caches of weapons and food were hidden along riverbanks, accessible only by water. Whole units could appear for an attack on a government outpost and then melt back into the riverine landscape, vanishing before a response could be mounted. A captured Viet Cong directive from 1965 stated this confidence plainly. The rivers are our roads. The people are our eyes. The night is our shield. The enemy is a blind giant who cannot follow where we go. For a time, this assessment was brutally accurate. The American response was initially clumsy. The U.S. Navy created the River Patrol Force, Task Force 116, known as Operation Game Warden. Their fiberglass patrol boat, river, PBRs, were fast and heavily armed, but they were loud. They could challenge the VC on the main channels during the day, but they couldn't penetrate the smaller canals, and they couldn't operate with stealth. The VC simply waited for them to pass, hidden just yards away. A different approach was needed. The problem was presented to a force that, in the mid-1960s, was still largely a shadowy experiment. They were the United States Navy's sea, air, and land teams. The SEALs. Their lineage traced back to the underwater demolition teams, the legendary naked warriors of World War II who cleared beaches for amphibious landings. But in 1961, President John F. Kennedy, fascinated with the potential of unconventional warfare, sought a new kind of force. In a speech to Congress, he called for a strengthening of our forces for the new kinds of challenges of the 1960s. He wanted men who could fight in the sea, from the air, and on the land. The SEALs were formally established on January 1st, 1962. Their training was, and remains, a thing of legend. A brutal crucible designed not just to build physical strength, but to systematically dismantle a man's ego and rebuild him as part of an unbreakable team. Basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, BUD/S, was a 6-month ordeal of cold water, sleepless nights, and constant physical and mental stress. But it was what came after BUD/S that forged the Vietnam-era SEAL. They learned guerrilla tactics from Army Special Forces. They learned to handle explosives with surgical precision. They learned to kill silently with their hands and with knives. They learned to speak Vietnamese, to read enemy maps, to understand the culture and mindset of their adversary. They were designed from the ground up to be the perfect counter-guerrilla. They were trained to out-guerrilla the guerrilla. When the first SEAL platoons from Team 1 arrived in South Vietnam in 1966, the conventional military establishment barely knew what to do with them. They were an oddity, seen by some as little more than highly trained swimmers. But in the Delta, they found their purpose. Their mission was simple in concept, but revolutionary in practice. Take the fight to the enemy in his own sanctuary. Hunt him where he felt safest. Use the water not as an obstacle, but as a weapon. The catalyst for the Vietcong's ideological collapse began with the first quiet insertion. Instead of roaring down a river in a PBR, a SEAL platoon would be dropped off miles away. They would slip over the side into the black water, each man carrying upwards of 60 pounds of specialized gear. They moved through the water with fins, silent and invisible, or they paddled small, inflatable boats, their faces and arms slathered in green and black camouflage paint that made them look like something not quite human. They established listening posts, lying motionless in the mud for days at a time, gathering intelligence. And then they set the ambush. On that October night on the Bossack River, the 7 men of X-ray platoon, SEAL Team 1, had been in the water for over an hour. The cold had seeped into their bones, but they ignored it. They were a study in predatory patience. Their leader, a young lieutenant, watched the approaching sampan through a starlight scope, a piece of technology that was itself a form of witchcraft. It gathered the faint ambient light from the stars and amplified it thousands of times, turning the pitch-black night into a grainy, ethereal green day. To the VC in the boat, the world was dark. To the SEALs watching them, they were perfectly illuminated targets. The lieutenant let the boat get closer. Closer. He waited until he could hear the gentle dip of their paddles in the water. He waited until the sampan was directly in the center of their pre-planned kill zone. He pressed the transmit button on his radio twice. A signal. The river erupted. It was not the sound of a conventional firefight. It was a sudden, concentrated, impossibly loud explosion of automatic weapons fire. The primary weapon of the SEALs was the Stoner 63 weapon system. It was a lightweight, modular rifle that could be configured as a standard rifle, a carbine, or, most terrifyingly, as a belt-fed light machine gun. Firing at over 800 rounds per minute, the sound of multiple stoners opening up at once was a physical shockwave. The VC in the sampan had no time to react. They had no time to understand. Their world, a moment before so placid and familiar, was ripped apart by a storm of 556mm rounds. The wooden boat disintegrated. The water around it churned white with bullet impacts. The ambush lasted less than 10 seconds. Then, silence returned, broken only by the tinkling of hot brass, casings falling into the water. The SEALs emerged from the river, wraiths of mud and water. They quickly searched the wreckage, recovering documents, weapons, and any other intelligence, before melting back into the jungle. By the time a VC reaction force arrived, they were gone. All that was left was the splintered remains of a boat and the bodies of 3 men who had learned too late that their sanctuary was compromised. This scene was repeated with variations hundreds of times over the next few years. The initial shock for the Vietcong was profound. Survivors of these first encounters gave confused, almost superstitious reports. They spoke of men with green faces who rose from the water. They described weapons that fired faster and with more accuracy than anything they had ever seen. They reported that these strange soldiers seemed to own the night, moving through it with an unnatural confidence. The psychological demolition had begun. The VC's confidence was being replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. Every shadow on the riverbank, every ripple in the water could now be a threat. The safe highway had become a gauntlet of terror. The effectiveness of this new American weapon was not based on superstition, but on a cold, hard, logistical reality. The story of the SEAL's success is a story of numbers. First, consider the environment. The Mekong Delta was a territory of 40,000 square kilometers, inhabited by nearly 8 million people, and dissected by a dense web of waterways totaling over 5,600 kilometers in length. To police this area conventionally was impossible. It required not a blunt instrument, but a scalpel. The number of SEALs in Vietnam at any one time was minuscule. Typically, there were no more than 12 to 14 platoons, totaling around 200 men, operational in the entire country. In the Delta, this number was often less than 100. 100 men tasked with terrorizing an enemy force that numbered in the tens of thousands. The disparity was made up for by a massive investment in training, technology, and support. The training pipeline to produce a single SEAL cost, in 1960s dollars, an estimated $250,000. This was an astronomical sum when a standard infantryman could be trained for a fraction of that cost. This investment produced a warrior of unparalleled skill and resilience. Then came the equipment, a manifestation of America's overwhelming material abundance. The standard SEAL loadout was a study in bespoke lethality. The Stoner 63 light machine gun, while sometimes unreliable, was incredibly light at just 12 pounds and could deliver a devastating volume of fire. SEALs often carried 600 to 1,000 rounds for it. Their sidearm was often the Smith & Wesson Model 39, sometimes fitted with a suppressor, a device that was almost mythical to the average VC. They carried the CAR-15, a shortened version of the M16, perfect for close-quarters combat. They used M79 grenade launchers, claymore mines, and slabs of C4 explosive. A single 7-man squad could carry a weight of firepower that would have been unthinkable for a much larger Vietcong unit, which was often constrained by a scarcity-driven need to conserve every single bullet. This abundance of ammunition fundamentally changed their tactics. While a VC soldier was trained to fire single-aim shots, a SEAL squad was trained in the art of violent, overwhelming fire suppression. They didn't just win firefights, they annihilated the enemy in a hurricane of lead. One SEAL, Franklin Anderson, described the philosophy: "We didn't believe in a fair fight. We believed in an unfair fight, heavily weighted in our favor. We wanted to be the baddest thing in the valley, the thing that everyone was afraid of." The numbers told this story with brutal clarity. By 1968, the operational tempo was relentless. SEAL platoons conducted over 300 missions that year. They were credited with killing over 600 enemy soldiers and capturing over 100. The intelligence they captured was even more valuable. Thousands of pages of documents, maps, and plans were recovered from the bodies of dead cadres or from their hidden caches. This intelligence fed a cycle of success. A capture document would reveal the location of another Vietcong base, which would then be targeted in another SEAL operation. The logistical support system that enabled this was a world away from the VC's reliance on sampans and hidden trails. SEALs were inserted by Seawolf helicopter gunships or by PBRs. They had constant radio contact with their command. If a mission went wrong, they could call upon a storm of supporting fire, from helicopter miniguns firing 6,000 rounds per minute to naval artillery, and even Air Force bombers. A wounded SEAL was not left to die in the jungle. A medical evacuation helicopter would be there in minutes. This was a safety net the Vietcong could not even comprehend. Their wounded were carried for days through the jungle, often dying from infections that a simple antibiotic would have cured. The numbers told a story of two different worlds at war. One was a world of scarcity, patience, and ideological fervor. The other was a world of overwhelming technology, professional training, and industrial logic. In the dark waters of the Mekong Delta, the industrial logic was proving to be far more deadly. The statistical deep dive, however, only tells part of the story. The true impact of the SEALs was felt on a human level, in the minds of the men who had to face them. The narrative must return to the ground, to the mud and the fear. It must be told through the eyes of those who were there. Lieutenant Gigi Dick Couch, who led a SEAL platoon in 1970, wrote about the visceral reality of a river ambush in his memoir, SEAL Team 1. He described the moments before the fight. The waiting was the worst part of any patrol. Your mind plays tricks on you in the dark. You try to control your breathing, to remain absolutely still. You feel the leeches on your skin, the insects crawling over you, but you can't move. You are waiting for the enemy, and you know that when it happens, it will be a matter of feet and seconds. This experience was the core of the SEAL mission. It was intimate, personal, and brutally violent. The psychological toll on the SEALs themselves was immense, but the effect on their enemies was systematically corrosive. Consider the story of a captured Vietcong soldier, Nguyen Van Hung, interrogated in 1969. His testimony, recorded in a declassified intelligence report, provides a window into the dawning horror felt by the VC. We were told the Americans could not fight in the jungle or at night, Hung stated. For a year, this was true. We moved freely on the river. Then, things changed. Patrols started to disappear. First, it was a supply boat on the Ho Chi Minh River. Then, a tax collector's sampan near my though. There were no survivors, just wreckage. He went on to describe the rumors that spread like a virus through the VC ranks. We heard stories of ghosts. Soldiers who came from the mud. They had strange, silent weapons. They took the heads of our leaders. We were ordered not to travel on the main rivers at night, only the small canals. But soon, they were in the small canals too. Nowhere was safe. My commander told us that if we saw them, we should not fight. We should run. How can you fight a ghost? This was the essence of the psychological victory. The SEALs were not just killing enemy soldiers. They were killing the enemy's confidence. They were destroying the foundational belief that had sustained the Viet Cong for years, their mastery of their own environment. Vignettes of realization occurred constantly. A VC sapper team, experts in stealth, crawling toward an American base, only to be hunted and eliminated in the darkness by a SEAL tracking team. A high-level political cadre, being moved between safe houses, snatched from his boat in the middle of the night, waking up in a detention center miles away with no idea how he got there. A Viet Cong platoon, resting in what they believed was a secure base camp, suddenly finding themselves in a perfectly coordinated assault from three sides, initiated by SEALs who had crept within yards of their position undetected. The SEALs cultivated this reputation for supernatural effectiveness. They used captured AK-47s to confuse the enemy. They left behind calling cards, symbols painted on the bodies of their enemies, to spread fear. In a Rung Sat Special Zone, a dense mangrove swamp near Saigon that was a major VC stronghold, they became so feared that the Viet Cong put a bounty on the head of any SEAL. It was a bounty that was, to history's knowledge, never successfully collected. The material abundance of the Americans was a source of constant shock to captured VC. One prisoner described being given a can of Coca-Cola and a cigarette after his capture by a SEAL platoon. He had been fighting for 3 years, subsisting on rice and brackish water. The casual offering of these luxuries, by men who had just tried to kill him, was a profound moment of cognitive dissonance. It was a small, seemingly mundane act, but revealed a profound strategic truth. His side was fighting a war of desperate scarcity. The Americans were fighting a war of such incredible abundance that they could afford to be casually generous with their prisoners moments after a firefight. He saw their medical kits filled with sterile bandages and morphine. He saw their radios that could speak to airplanes. He saw them eat strange, foil-wrapped food. He realized, in that moment, that he was not just fighting an army. He was fighting a factory. He was fighting a system so powerful and wealthy that its frontline soldiers possessed luxuries he had never seen in his life. This observation was the ideological collapse in miniature. The war, for him, was no longer about revolutionary zeal versus foreign invaders. It was about a primitive, agrarian society trying to fight a futuristic, industrial superpower. And he knew, with a crushing certainty, which side would ultimately win a war of attrition fought on those terms. By 1970, the cumulative effect of these operations reached a tipping point. The point of no return was not marked by a single battle, but by a change in the enemy's own documents. Intelligence intercepts and capture plans began to show a fundamental shift in Vietcong strategy in the Delta. Directives were issued that explicitly warned of the American commandos who hunt in the water at night. Units were instructed to avoid all water travel after dark if possible. This was a catastrophic blow to their logistics. Moving on land was slower, more difficult, and exposed them to conventional American patrols and air power. The Riverine highway system, once their greatest asset, had become a liability. They were being forced to abandon their own sanctuary. The SEALs had achieved a strategic victory that went far beyond their small numbers. They had effectively denied the enemy his primary means of maneuver and supply in the most critical region of South Vietnam. The concession, the ultimate admission of this defeat, came years later, after the war was over. In memoirs and interviews, former North Vietnamese and Viet Cong commanders spoke of the SEALs with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. General Tran Van Tra, a senior Viet Cong commander, wrote in his history of the war that special units caused disproportionate difficulties for our forces in the swampy regions. He admitted that their surprise attacks and kidnappings of our officers created an atmosphere of anxiety. This was a sanitized official admission. The private admissions were more stark. In a post-war interview, a former NVA colonel was asked what he feared most during his time in the South. He didn't mention B-52 strikes or artillery barges. He said, "The men who came at night, the ones he never saw, we did not know how to fight them. They were like tigers in the jungle. It was not a soldier's war against them. It was a war of survival." This was the final validation of the SEALs' mission. They had transcended their role as soldiers and become a force of nature in the minds of their enemy. They had become the new monster in the dark. Their most famous operation, the stuff of legend and Medal of Honor citations, often involved daring rescues or desperate last stands. But their true, strategic victory was quieter. It was the sum of hundreds of small, terrifying ambushes in the dark. It was the slow, methodical erosion of the enemy's will to fight in the one place he had once called his own. They didn't conquer the Mekong Delta. They poisoned it for the enemy. They turned the water from a source of life into a source of fear. The grand conclusion of this story is not about who won the Vietnam War. It is about how a specific battle, the battle for the night, was won. It is a testament to the idea that a small number of highly specialized individuals, backed by the full weight of an industrial power, can defeat a larger, ideologically driven opponent by systematically dismantling their psychological and logistical foundations. The Viet Cong were not beaten by brute force. They were beaten by an idea of a warrior who could be more patient, more stealthy, and infinitely more violent than they were. The numbers provide the final, staggering epitaph to this campaign. Over the course of the war, approximately 2,000 men served as SEALs in Vietnam. 48 of them were killed in action. They operated in tiny teams, often less than 10 men, deep in enemy territory. Their official kill ratio was often cited as being close to 200 to 1, a number that is almost certainly an exaggeration born of the chaotic nature of their battles. But the true figure is undeniably and astonishingly high. They were awarded 2 medals of honor, dozens of Navy Crosses, and hundreds of silver and bronze stars. But the most important statistic is the one that can never be truly measured. It is the number of Vietcong operations that never happened. The number of attacks that were aborted because supplies couldn't get through. The number of cadres who refused to travel at night. The creeping paralysis that gripped an enemy who learned that his home was no longer safe. The final, encapsulating anecdote comes from a reunion of veterans in the 1990s. A former SEAL was approached by a man who had been a South Vietnamese interpreter working with Special Forces. The interpreter told the SEAL about an experience he had interrogating a captured VC officer in 1971. The officer was defiant and proud, spouting revolutionary slogans. The interpreter asked him why, if his cause was so just and his victory so certain, he was so afraid to travel the rivers his forces claimed to control. The VC officer's defiance finally broke. He looked at the interpreter and said, in a low, haunted voice, "The river is where the Americans put their devils." That is the legacy of the SEALs in Vietnam. They did not just fight a war on the rivers of the Mekong Delta. They became the reason to fear the water itself. They became the devils. The war is over. The men are old. The jungles have grown back. But the lesson remains. It demonstrates that the most effective weapon is not always the largest bomb or the biggest army. Sometimes, it is a whisper in the dark. It is the cold realization of an enemy that they are being hunted in their own home by a foe who is better at their own game. It is the shattering of an illusion. And in the dark, murky waters of history, that is a victory that echoes long after the guns have fallen silent. The rivers are quiet now, but the principle they proved is not. A dedicated, technologically superior force can impose its will, not by conquering territory, but by conquering the mind of its enemy. That is how the sanctuary was broken. That is how the illusion of control was systematically and permanently destroyed.